Welcome in and thank you for being here. Tonight we're going to step back in time and explore some of the deadliest jobs of the Victorian era, work that powered an age of progress but often at a terrible human cost. These are stories of ordinary people who faced extraordinary danger simply to survive and whose lives are rarely remembered in history books. Before we begin, I'd love to get to know you a little better. If you're comfortable, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always enjoy reading your comments and learning where in the world these stories are being heard. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's uncover the forgotten lives behind Victorian progress, one job at a time. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a narrow, fog-soaked Victorian street at 3 in the morning. Every window is dark, every shop is locked. But at the end of the lane, behind a warped wooden door, a dim orange glow flickers. Inside, the bakery is already alive. It has to be, because Victorian bread, the most important food in Britain, must be ready by sunrise. And this is where our story truly begins, because in the Victorian era, the baker's day didn't start at dawn. It started when most people were climbing into bed. A typical Victorian baker rolled up his sleeves between midnight and 1 a.m. He pushed open the bakery door and stepped into a room already thick with the smell of yeast and last night's stale flour. There were no whistles of machinery here, only the heavy thump of kneading fists and the rasp of laboured breathing. Bakers worked 13 to 16 hours straight, often 7 days a week, with no breaks except to lift blistered hands from the dough long enough to wipe sweat from their eyes. The massive brick ovens were still warm from the previous day, another hazard waiting to happen. Victorian ovens often reached 500 degrees Fahrenheit or more, and bakers had to lean inside them with wooden peels, sometimes so far that eyebrows, hair and skin singed if they weren't careful. Burns weren't an accident, they were a guarantee. Apprentices joked that you couldn't be a baker if your hands weren't already half cooked. But burns were not the deadliest part. The real danger was the flour itself. Every motion in that cramped bakery, every slap of dough, every scoop of flour, released pale clouds into the air. So much flour dust filled the room that bakers inhaled it constantly, night after night. The result was a slow, suffocating condition known as baker's lung. The dust scarred the lungs, clogged the airway, and left bakers wheezing like men twice their age. Victorian medical reports describe bakers gasping for breath on the street, coughing until streaks of blood appeared. Many died young, some in their 40s, rare to see old age. Their high mortality rate was so well known that people joked about bakers retiring early whether they wanted to or not. And yet the work kept getting harder. Bakers didn't use mixers, they used their bodies. Kneading dough wasn't a gentle hobby, it was a violent physical battle. Dough for several hundred loaves could weigh more than 300 pounds, and bakers lifted, punched, folded, and threw it using only muscle and determination. Shoulder injuries, hernias, and chronic joint pain were simply part of the trade. Imagine working all night, breathing flour, sweating beside an oven, knuckles cracked from kneading, only to step outside into the cold dawn to deliver bread door to door. Some bakers collapsed on their rounds, others slept only a few hours before starting again. Victorian society relied on bakers, but sacrificed them in the process. Bread was life. Bakers supplied it, and the world quietly accepted that providing it cost them their own. This was the deadly, exhausting, invisible battle of the Victorian baker, and it was only the beginning. For most Victorian families, bread wasn't just part of the diet, it was the diet. Working class people sometimes ate little else. But here's the horrifying truth. Much of that bread wasn't just unhealthy, it was dangerously adulterated, and the bakers who made it paid the highest price. To keep bread looking white, soft and cheap, Victorian bakers used additives that today would be locked away in a chemical lab. Let's start with the infamous one, alum. Alum was a chalky white powder used to bleach bread flour. It made the bread look high quality even when the flour was cheap or spoiled. Victorians prized white bread because it symbolised purity and class. So bakers were pressured to use alum to meet customer expectations. But for the bakers handling it, alum was a silent killer. Bakers mixed it by hand, breathing in its fine particles. Alum caused burning throats, stomach pain, ulcers, and crippling digestive issues. Long-term exposure destroyed the kidneys and weakened the bones. Some bakers were so poisoned that they collapsed in their shops, unable to stand. But alum wasn't even the worst offender. Bread was sometimes bulked out with chalk, plaster of Paris, and even arsenic-tainted whitening agents from unscrupulous flour suppliers. A baker might not even know they were using contaminated ingredients until symptoms appeared. By the mid-1800s, government investigations discovered that over half of London's bread had been adulterated. Consumers suffered, but bakers suffered more. They handled the chemicals unprotected, breathing fumes, mixing powders and kneading dough that irritated their skin and entered their bloodstream through tiny cracks and burns. Doctors reported cases of bakers with chronic poisoning, paralysis, ulcerated hands, failing eyesight, internal bleeding. Imagine a baker reaching into a dough trough only to feel the sting of alum eating at open blisters. Imagine breathing arsenic-laced dust without knowing it. Imagine your body failing and still needing to work another 15-hour shift because you had no other way to survive. And here's the cruel twist. If a baker refused to use these additives, their bread looked darker and inferior, so customers walked away. If they used them, they risked their health, and sometimes criminal charges, since adulteration laws changed constantly. It was a deadly tightrope walk. Make the bread people demanded or starve. Make the bread correctly or die sooner. This was the poisoned world of Victorian baking, where even purity couldn't be trusted and where the cost of a loaf was measured not just in pennies, but in lives. Victorian bakeries weren't just unhealthy, they were architectural death traps, built in ways that set the stage for disaster. Most bakeries were tiny, windowless, cellar-like rooms tucked beneath crowded streets. Space in Victorian cities was expensive, so baking was literally pushed underground. Down narrow steps you'd find the ovens, the dough troughs, the flour bins, the workers and gallons of stale, flour-thick air. Now imagine hundreds of pounds of flour dust settling on every beam, shelf, and oven crack. Flour dust is more than a nuisance. It's highly explosive. Many Victorians didn't know this, but flour suspended in the air can ignite with the force of a bomb. The combination of fine particles, enclosed space, and a spark from an oven could blow apart an entire shop. And it happened, often enough to terrify inspectors. Reports tell of bakery explosions that shattered windows across entire streets. Some bakers were thrown across rooms, others were burned alive when flames raced across the dust-coated walls. But explosions weren't the only threat. Those same cramped rooms meant oxygen dropped rapidly. Ovens consumed air, burning fuel and producing carbon monoxide. In today's world, carbon monoxide detectors save lives. In Victorian bakeries, no such thing existed. Bakers often worked in a half-conscious state. Some fainted into dough troughs, some collapsed near ovens and died quietly. Others simply never woke up from their midday nap after a night shift. There were bakeries so notoriously suffocating that neighbours complained of hearing workers coughing all night through the thin walls. Then there was the heat. Ovens heated the tiny workspace to unbearable temperatures, often over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 49 degrees Celsius, with no ventilation. Bakers worked soaked in sweat, clothing sticking to their skin, hands so swollen from heat that removing rings became impossible. And the ovens? They were unpredictable beasts. Some collapsed, some burst bricks outward, some belched flames unexpectedly. Burns were so common that many bakers wrapped their arms in cloths wet with cold water, but those quickly dried in the oppressive heat. Even apprentices, some as young as 10, were pulled into the chaos. Their small size made them ideal for crawling into cooling ovens to scrape out soot and stuck dough. Many suffocated, some became trapped, a few never made it out alive. The Victorian bakery was not a cosy room filled with the smell of fresh bread. It was a furnace, a cave, a powder keg, a place where every breath, every movement, every spark had the potential to be fatal. And yet, every street had one, every town needed them, and every baker returned the next day, because danger was part of the job, so common that it was hardly mentioned. To understand how deadly the Victorian baking trade truly was, we need to look at the people trapped within it, not just the ovens and flour, but the human stories behind the bread. The life of a Victorian baker often began in childhood. Families desperate for income sent boys to apprenticeships as young as 9 or 10. These children lived above the bakery, sleeping in cramped attic rooms, still warm from the ovens below. Apprenticeship meant cheap or practically free labour. Boys worked the same brutal hours as adults, mixing, kneading, carrying sacks of flour nearly half their body weight. They were often beaten for mistakes, denied meals for slow work, and expected to obey without question. Break a loaf, get slapped, burn a batch, go without supper, fall asleep, get kicked awake. And yet these boys were the lifeblood of the Victorian baking industry. Their bodies grew warped under the strain. Many developed chronic, stooped posture from the hours spent bending over dough troughs. Their hands became thick with calluses. Their fingernails cracked from constant exposure to dough, flour, and heat. By adulthood, many bakers were physically ruined. Victorian doctors described bakers as pale, wheezing, and prematurely aged. They often looked 20 years older than they were. Women rarely married bakers because the profession was known for early death and chronic sickness. Some bakers lived their entire lives without marriage or children because they couldn't support a family or feared leaving them widowed. It didn't help that bakers often had no social life whatsoever. When normal people awoke, bakers were ending their shifts. When others returned home from work, bakers were trying to sleep. Their schedule isolated them from society, making many feel trapped and invisible. But the deadliest truth was this: the industry treated bakers as replaceable. If a baker grew too sick to knead or too breathless to work through the night, the master simply found a new apprentice or hired a younger man. There was no compensation, no medical support, no union strong enough to protect them until very late in the era. Even the rare attempts at reform fell short. Medical journals warned about flour dust poisoning and heat exhaustion, but bakery owners insisted nothing could change. Bread was essential, they argued. Britain needed it, and bakers needed to endure whatever the job required. And so they endured. They sold their youth to the ovens, as one social critic wrote. Their lungs, their backs, their skin, their sleep, all sacrificed for bread that sold 4 pennies. It's easy today to picture a baker as a friendly figure in a clean apron, but in Victorian England, bakers were closer to factory workers trapped in deadly conditions that slowly stripped their health away. Their suffering fed a hungry empire. Their sacrifices filled every table. Their stories, for the most part, vanished without recognition. But today, we can remember them, not as faceless labourers doing a simple job, but as workers standing at the edge of danger every single day. Their trade was essential and lethal, a quiet, constant battle for survival fought with nothing but dough, fire, and the resilience of the human spirit. Imagine stepping into a dim, sulphur-scented factory in 1880s London. It's early morning, still dark outside, and the only light comes from the faint glow of gas lamps. Dozens of young women, some barely in their teens, sit shoulder to shoulder at long wooden tables, dipping wooden splints into a toxic white paste. That paste is white phosphorus. They don't know it yet, or maybe they do, but choose not to think about it. But this job, making the matches that lit Victorian homes, was one of the slowest and most gruesome killers of the entire era. These workers were called match girls, and this is what their lives were really like. The Bryant and May match factory in London was one of the biggest employers of young women in the East End. It looked enormous, impressive, almost modern. But step inside and you found a nightmare. Windows were kept shut because drafts ruined the matches. Ventilation was nearly non-existent. Flour-like phosphorus dust coated every surface. Workers inhaled it all day. Many match girls began working at age 12 or 13, some even younger. Their job was simple. Dip wooden sticks into molten phosphorus paste, let them dry, then pack them into boxes. But each step exposed them to fumes that would slowly eat at their bones. One worker described the air as a sweet, sickening smell that clung to your throat. Victorian factories were strict, especially for poor women who had no other employment options. Match girls faced fines for talking, fines for letting hair fall from their headscarves, fines for slow work, fines for broken matches, even fines for arriving a minute late, which could wipe out a day's wages. A girl could work a 14-hour shift and still owe money by the end of the week. Many were already malnourished, exhausted, and living in overcrowded slums. This made them even more vulnerable to the poison surrounding them. White phosphorus is one of the most toxic substances ever used in consumer manufacturing. When inhaled or absorbed through the gums, it caused a disease so horrifying that Victorian doctors wrote about it with visible dread: phossy jaw. At first it seemed harmless, a little toothache, maybe some swelling, but then teeth loosened and fell out. Gums turned green. The jawbone began to glow faintly in the dark due to chemical reaction. The bone literally started to die. As the infection spread, it created open holes in the face. The smell was unbearable. Some described it as a mix of garlic and death. Many women were shunned on public transport because the stench followed them. Treatment was brutal. Surgical removal of the jaw, often without modern anesthesia. And if they didn't get the surgery, the infection spread to the brain. Death was inevitable. In some factories, management tried to hide sick workers, sending them home quietly so customers wouldn't see the consequences of their product. They rarely received medical care or compensation. Bryant and May made enormous profits selling cheap matches. The factory owners defended white phosphorus because it made matches ignite quickly, perfect for sales, terrible for workers. The company ignored health warnings from doctors, safety reports, pleas from workers, a growing number of disfigured or dead girls. Many workers begged management to switch to red phosphorus, a safer alternative discovered in 1845. It didn't cause phossy jaw, but since red phosphorus was more expensive, most companies refused. The workers paid the price instead. A typical day began around 6 a.m. The girls lined up outside the factory, waiting for the doors to open. Once inside, they worked until evening with only a few breaks. The conditions included open buckets of phosphorus paste, constant fumes, burns from molten chemicals, splinters from wooden sticks, cuts that became infected from exposure. Food was eaten with contaminated hands. Many girls lost hair and fingernails. Some coughed up phosphorus dust. Their clothes absorbed the smell. Their skin absorbed the poison. Their lungs slowly filled with microscopic crystals. And yet, quitting wasn't an option. There were almost no jobs for poor working-class women. In 1888, after decades of suffering, the match girls finally fought back. A young activist named Annie Besant published a scathing exposé titled "White Slavery in London." It detailed the fines, the starvation wages, and the health horrors inside the factory. Bryant and May tried to force workers to sign documents saying her claims were lies. The girls refused. Over 1,400 match girls walked out in protest. The match girl strike of 1888. They marched through London, most of them teenagers wearing tattered clothes, but their voices were strong. The public rallied behind them. Within weeks, Bryant and May caved. They abolished unfair fines, improved ventilation, allowed meal breaks, raised wages, stopped firing girls without cause. Their bravery marked one of the first major victories for women's labour rights. But many of the girls never lived to see the long-term change, their bodies already damaged beyond repair. The global push to end white phosphorus matches began in the early 1900s. Many countries banned it entirely. Britain finally followed in 1910, ending decades of preventable suffering. By then, countless match girls had died. Others lived with permanent deformities, all for something that cost a penny a box. The next time someone imagines Victorian Britain as quaint or charming, remember the match girls, the teenagers who dipped wooden sticks into poison so the rest of the world could strike a flame. Their story reminds us that even the simplest everyday object, like a match, once carried a price paid in human life. Imagine waking up before sunrise in London, 1840. The air is cold, your clothes are threadbare, and your stomach is still empty from the night before. You are 8 years old, maybe younger, and your job today is simple. Climb inside a pitch-black chimney, wriggle through a smoke-stained tunnel barely wider than your shoulders, and scrape away soot until you can't breathe. This was the life of a Victorian chimney sweep, and few jobs claimed more children than this one. Victorian chimneys weren't the wide, straight tubes we picture today. They were narrow, twisting, angled like mazes. Sometimes no wider than 9 inches across, adults were far too big to fit inside. So the industry turned to the smallest bodies available, poor children sold by desperate parents or taken from orphanages. They were called climbing boys, even though many were girls disguised for work. Some began as young as 5 years old. Their master sweep would wake them by poking them with a stick, and if they hesitated, they were beaten or threatened. Poverty meant compliance. Inside the chimney, the world closed in. Imagine crawling upward in the dark, pressing your knees, elbows, and bare feet against rough brick. Soot clouds fill your lungs. Heat radiates from the fireplace below. The air smells of ash, smoke, and last night's fire. Your tools? Just a scraper, a brush, and your own body. Children scraped soot from the walls, letting it rain down into their faces. Many carried bags in their teeth, adding more weight while keeping their hands free. And the moment soot entered the eyes, the burning was unbearable. If they panicked or got stuck, and many did, there was no room to turn around. The master sweeps sometimes lit a small fire below to encourage them upward. Many children died right where they worked, wedged into the brickwork, unable to move. Soot was not just dirty, it was deadly. Climbing boys suffered from chronic respiratory disease, asthma, blackened lungs, carbon monoxide poisoning, and, most famously, soot wart, the first recorded occupational cancer in history. This cancer formed on the scrotum, the place where soot collected in folds of skin. It was horrifyingly painful and almost always fatal. Many sweeps did not live past their 20s. The surgeon Percival Pott, who first described the disease, called sweeping a form of slow murder sanctioned by society. To prevent children from escaping or refusing the job, masters used cruel training methods. One method was chillingly named the master's shilling. A child was pushed up a chimney and forced to climb using elbows and knees until his skin was rubbed raw. This was considered the initiation, and the child received a single shilling afterward, even though that coin often went straight back to the master. In winter, masters sometimes lit straw fires beneath the flue to keep the children warm, or to force them to climb faster. If a child cried or refused, they were beaten with canes poked with sticks, or starved. Newspapers of the time frequently reported children found suffocated, stuck, burned alive, or dead from exhaustion. But the work continued because the job was cheap, fast, and essential for keeping Victorian homes from catching fire. Chimney sweeps rarely had beds. Most slept on. Old soot sacks, piles of rags, cold floors. Their bodies were perpetually blackened even after washing. Soot was embedded under nails and in hair. Many were underweight, stunted, and plagued by constant infections. They rarely had access to medical care, and because their work kept them isolated from other children, many sweeps grew up unable to read or write. Their world was soot, darkness, and fear. It wasn't until 1875, after multiple scandals and the death of a young boy named George Brewster, that a sweeping ban finally took hold. He died trapped in a flue at just 11 years old. The tragedy enraged Parliament. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 made it illegal to send children up chimneys. But for many, the law came too late. Generations of children had already been sacrificed to soot, fire, and poverty. Victorian society considered chimney sweeps lucky, a superstition still echoed in weddings today. But the truth behind that belief is darker than most people realise. Sweeps became symbols of luck because they lived through the impossible. Most didn't. Their survival was a miracle. Their work was a hidden horror that kept Victorian homes warm and cosy, while destroying the bodies of the smallest, poorest children. When we picture the Victorian era, elegant dresses, gas lamps, roaring fireplaces, it's easy to forget the children whose bodies made that comfort possible. Chimney sweeps lived and died in darkness so the rest of the world could live in light. Their story is one of the clearest reminders that behind every golden age lies a shadow, one cast by the people no one wanted to see. Picture the early morning fog rolling over a Victorian mining town. The air is thick with coal dust. The streets smell of smoke and sweat. And before the sun has even risen, thousands of workers, men, women, and children, are already descending into the earth. The mine's mouth yawns open like a beast. A wooden cage rattles, ropes creak, and lanterns bob in the blackness below. The Victorian mine was not a workplace, it was a death trap, disguised as industry, and for many the only way out was deeper still. Mining in the Victorian era wasn't just a job, it was a birthright. Families lived in mining towns where there were few other options. Boys followed their fathers underground, some beginning work as early as 5 or 6 years old. Children served as trappers, opening and closing ventilation doors, hurriers, pulling coal carts on all fours, putter boys and girls shoving heavy tubs of coal, lamp carriers. Women and young girls often worked above ground sorting coal, but in some regions they worked underground too, dragging coal carts using chains strapped around their waists like beasts of burden. Mining was the backbone of Victorian progress, fueling factories, trains and steamships, but that progress came with a body count. The journey underground was dangerous before the work even began. Workers descended in primitive elevators, wooden cages known as kibbles, that were lifted by rope. The rope was often worn, frayed, or improperly maintained. Many miners died simply from falling hundreds of feet when the lift snapped. For those who made it down safely, the mine presented an entirely new world. Pitch-black tunnels, narrow shafts, knee-deep water ceilings that pressed down to shoulder height, miles of labyrinthine passages. The deeper the mine, the hotter it became. Some miners worked in temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, sweating in oppressive humidity, struggling to breathe in the furnace-like air. Victorian mines had 4 enemies more feared than any boss or overseer. 1. Fire damp, methane, an invisible gas lurking in pockets underground. One spark, just a single flame from a miner's lamp, could ignite the cavern. The explosion ripped through tunnels like a hurricane of fire, killing dozens or hundreds instantly. 2. Black damp, carbon dioxide. When oxygen was consumed by rotting wood, coal dust, or other gases, black damp filled the space silently. Miners would grow dizzy, drop their tools, collapse unconscious. They often died before help arrived. 3. Flooding. One wrong strike of a pickaxe and an entire underground lake, held back only by thin rock, could burst into the tunnels. Water filled the mine in minutes, trapping miners in darkness as they desperately tried to outrun the rising flood. 4. Roof collapse. Perhaps the most common killer, Mines relied on wooden beams that often rotted, cracked, or were spaced too far apart. A sudden rumble, a groan of timber, and the roof caved in, crushing miners instantly or sealing them inside chambers with no escape. The Victorian government once sent inspectors into the mines to learn how children were being used. What they found shocked even hardened industrial leaders. Children crawling on all fours, harnessed to coal carts by leather straps. Girls with bruised hips from dragging loads heavier than their own bodies. Many children grew up stunted, with twisted spines and bowed legs from years of crawling in cramped passages. One 17-year-old girl testified, "I pull coal like a horse does. The belt cuts me. I work until I drop." This wasn't rare. It was the norm. Life underground meant breathing coal dust constantly. Black particles clung to the air, the walls and the skin. Miners inhaled it deeply with every breath. Over time, the dust hardened inside their lungs. This became black lung disease, or pneumoconiosis, one of the slowest, most painful Victorian deaths. Symptoms included chronic coughing, coughing up black mucus, shortness of breath, collapsing lungs, suffocation from the inside out. Many miners died before age 40. Their bodies were so coated in soot that even in death their lungs were described as pitch black. Victorian newspapers often reported catastrophic mining disasters, some of the worst industrial tragedies in history. 1842, the Hoscar Pit disaster, where 26 children drowned trying to escape a flooded shaft. 1866, Oaks Colliery explosion, killing 361 miners. 1894, Pontypridd explosion, killing 264. Entire communities lost fathers, brothers, sons and children in a single day. Bodies were sometimes unrecognizable, burned or crushed. Rescue workers described scenes so horrific they refused to speak of them in detail, but the mines reopened within days. Families still had to eat. Mining towns were some of the poorest in Britain. Homes were crowded coal damp filled with soot. Wives often became widows before age 30. Children grew up expecting to lose their fathers in the mines, and many did. Miners were paid by the amount of coal they extracted, not by the hour. If they were injured, they made nothing. If they complained, they were fired. It was a system designed to squeeze every last ounce of labour from every life. Public outrage, horrifying death tolls, and workers' strikes eventually brought reforms. The Mines and Collieries Act of 1842 banned women and children under 10 from underground work, safety lamps, replaced open flames, ventilation, improved inspections, increased. But even with reforms, Victorian mining remained one of the most fatal occupations in the world. Workers knew every day might be their last. And yet they continued. Because mining was more than a job, it was the only lifeline many families had. When we picture the Victorian age, steam trains, factories, glowing lamps, we often imagine innovation and progress. But every spark of Victorian light came from coal pulled from the earth by miners whose lungs, backs and lives paid the price. Their story is a reminder that beneath Britain's industrial triumphs lay a world of darkness few ever saw, and fewer survived. Imagine stepping into a massive brick building in 1850. It stretches the length of a city block, its windows rattling with the roar inside. As soon as the doors swing open, a wall of heat and dust hits you. The air is thick with cotton fibres, smoke, and the metallic stench of oil. Rows of enormous machines, spinning mules, carding engines, power looms, shake the floor as they thunder in relentless motion. You join hundreds of workers, some as young as 8 years old, all swallowed by the iron belly of the Industrial Revolution. This is the Victorian factory, a place where your life depended on whether the machine noticed you or not. Factories made Britain powerful. They pumped out textiles, steel, metal goods, paper, candles, shoes, every product of the booming Victorian economy. But behind the progress was a secret. Factories were among the deadliest workplaces of the century. Why? Because machines didn't stop for tired hands, drifting hair-loose clothing, or children who moved too slowly. A machine didn't know the difference between cotton and flesh. And Victorian factories were built to run fast, faster than human reflexes. Children were highly desirable workers. They were cheap, quick, small enough to crawl beneath machinery, easily controlled. Many began factory work at age 6 or 7, spending 12 to 16 hours a day in thunderous noise. Common child jobs included scavengers, crawling under running machines to pick up fallen cotton, doffers, removing full bobbins and replacing them with empty ones, piecers, leaning over spinning frames to fix broken threads. One slip meant crushed fingers, scalped hair, severed limbs, or instant death. Factory owners kept the machines running even after accidents. More profit meant more bodies. Noise in textile mills was deafening. Spinning machines clattered. Looms pounded like artillery. Gears rattled. Steam engines hissed and roared. Workers had to shout directly into each other's ears just to communicate. Many were partially or totally deaf by adulthood. Some describe the factory floor as standing inside a thunderstorm made of iron. The noise followed them home, ringing in their ears, vibrating in their skulls, haunting their dreams. Factories were hot, humid, and thick with airborne fibres, dust, and oils. Textile mills purposely kept humidity high so cotton threads wouldn't snap. Workers felt like they were breathing through a wet cloth. The result? Byssinosis, also called brown lung, caused by inhaling cotton fibre. Symptoms included tight chest coughing up thick brown mucus, difficulty breathing, lung damage, early death. Other factories created their own toxic environments. Matches released phosphorus fumes. Dyes contained arsenic paints, used lead steelworks, filled the air with soot and metallic dust. Every breath was a risk. Victorian machinery was enormous, fast, and completely unprotected. There were no safety guards, no emergency stops, no protective clothing, no regulations. Loose hair wrapped around a spindle could tear a scalp clean off. A sleeve caught in a gear could yank in an entire arm. Workers lost fingers, hands, and limbs at horrifying rates. One factory inspector wrote, "It is difficult to find a worker who has not lost a finger or suffered some disfigurement." Children were especially vulnerable. Their small bodies fit too easily between belts, shafts, and spinning wheels. Many fatalities happened when a child was told to retrieve something beneath the machine. And the machine didn't stop. It never stopped. Victorian factory hours were brutal, 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Only a short break for food. Workers often woke before dawn and returned home long after dark. Many slept sitting upright because their muscles were too sore to lie flat. Exhaustion made the job even more dangerous. A tired worker was slower, and in the factory, slow meant dead. Even pregnant women were expected to work until the day they gave birth. Some gave birth on the factory floor. Factory owners enforced strict rules to maintain productivity, fines for arriving late. Fines for talking, fines for dropping thread, fines for damaged goods. Children could be beaten if they slowed down. Workers who lost limbs were often fired for being no longer useful. Cripples were discarded by the industry that broke them. The boss's word was law. Some factories kept children awake by having overseers walk the aisles, carrying leather straps, sticks, or canes. Public outrage eventually forced change, especially after reformers exposed the brutal treatment of children. Key improvements came through: Factory Acts of 1833, 1844, and 1850, limits on child labour, required schooling for child workers, restrictions on working hours, safer but still dangerous machinery. Even with reforms, Victorian factories remained deadly well into the late 19th century. But these early regulations laid the groundwork for the modern labour protections we now take for granted. Factory workers powered the Victorian age. Every spool of thread, every iron beam, every sheet of paper, every symbol of progress was built by people who risked their lives daily. Their sacrifices made Britain wealthy. Their suffering fueled the world's advancements. Their bodies paid for the revolution of machines. And behind every photograph of proud factory owners or gleaming textile mills, there's a hidden truth. The Industrial Revolution was stained with the blood, sweat, and broken bones of the workers who kept the machines alive. When people talk about the Victorian era, they often marvel at the railways, iron tracks stretching across the countryside, tunnels bored through mountains, bridges soaring over rivers. Victorians called it progress. They called it modernity. They called it a triumph of engineering, but they rarely spoke of the men who built it. They were called navvies, short for navigators, and their job was to carve Britain into shape using nothing but muscle, picks, shovels, and explosives. It was one of the most brutal and deadly jobs of the entire century. Navvies were unskilled manual labourers, often poor men from rural Britain or Ireland. Many were fleeing famine, unemployment, or crushing poverty. They followed work wherever it appeared: railway lines, canals, tunnels, bridges, docks, sewage systems. They lived in temporary camps near construction sites, moving from project to project like ghosts of industry. Their reputation was rough. They were feared, looked down upon, and often blamed for crime or disorder. But in reality, they were men doing work most others physically couldn't survive. Navvies worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. There were no machines to help them. They dug solid rock, frozen earth, waterlogged clay, using hand tools. Every shovel of earth had to be lifted, carried, and dumped by human strength alone. A single navvy might move 20 tons of earth per day. Blisters turned into open wounds, muscles tore, backs bent permanently. Many navvies walked with a permanent stoop by their 30s, if they lived that long. Tunnel building was the deadliest part of the job. Navvies dug underground passages through unstable rock with minimal support. Wooden beams were used sparingly, often too sparingly, because they slowed the work. Common tunnel deaths included cave-ins, falling rock suffocation, oxygen deprivation, flooding. Some tunnels collapsed repeatedly during construction, killing men again and again as the work continued. In certain projects, it was quietly accepted that one man would die for every few yards of tunnel completed. Bodies were sometimes buried nearby so work could continue without delay. Victorian construction relied heavily on explosives, but safety standards were nearly non-existent. Navvies used gunpowder later, nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin was terrifyingly unstable. It could explode from vibration, temperature change, or a simple mistake. Navvies mixed, transported, and placed explosives by hand. If the fuse burned too fast, they died. If the blast misfired, they were sent back in to investigate, often triggering the explosion themselves. Many lost hands, eyes, faces, or their lives instantly. Explosions echoed across construction sites with frightening regularity. Railways and bridges required towering scaffolding made of wood and rope. There were no harnesses, no safety nets, no helmets. A slip on wet timber or loose planks could send a navvy plunging dozens of feet onto rock or iron. Broken necks were common. Survivors often lived with crushed limbs or permanent disability and no compensation. If a man couldn't work, he was replaced. Navvy living conditions were appalling. Workers lived in makeshift huts or overcrowded lodging houses called shanty towns. They lacked clean water, sanitation, proper food, medical care. Disease spread rapidly. Cholera, typhus, dysentery, and smallpox tore through camps, sometimes killing dozens within days. In some railway projects, more men died from disease than from accidents. Alcohol became a coping mechanism for many, fueling the stereotype of the violent navvy while masking deep exhaustion and trauma. Navvies were paid better than factory workers, but only because the work destroyed bodies so quickly. Wages were often docked for bad weather, tool damage, missed days due to injury. There was no sick pay, no compensation for death. Widows and children were left destitute. If a man was crushed, drowned, or blown apart, the project continued the same day. Railways waited for no one. Victorian newspapers reported construction deaths with disturbing casualness. Another fatal accident occurred yesterday. Several labourers were killed. These weren't shocking events. They were expected. Some railway lines became infamous for their death tolls. Entire communities knew which projects were cursed, but men still lined up for work because hunger was worse than fear. Despite everything navvies built, Britain's railway network, canals that fueled trade tunnels that still carry trains today, bridges still standing over rivers, their labour reshaped landscapes and connected cities. And yet most were never named. No statues, no plaques, just bones beneath the earth they moved. Victorian Britain celebrated speed, power and expansion. Trains raced across the land. Goods flowed faster than ever before, but every mile of track was laid by men who risked death daily. Navvies were not reckless. They were not expendable. They were simply poor, and society decided that was enough. Their story reminds us that progress is never free. Sometimes it is paid for in blood, sweat, and silence. When Victorian London went to sleep, another workforce woke up. The streets fell quiet. Gas lamps flickered. Doors were bolted shut. And in the darkness, carts creaked slowly through alleyways carrying barrels, shovels, and men with iron stomachs. These men were known as night soil men. Their job was to remove human waste by hand from cesspits beneath homes, courtyards, schools and businesses. Without them, Victorian cities would have drowned in their own filth, and many of these men nearly did. Before modern sewer systems, most Victorian homes used cesspits, deep underground holes lined with brick or clay, designed to collect human waste. Some cesspits served a single household, an entire apartment building, schools, hospitals, factories. Many had not been emptied for years. Waste seeped into soil, contaminated wells, and released noxious gases into homes. When cesspits overflowed or collapsed, night soil men were called in. They worked at night to avoid public outrage, because no one wanted to see what kept their city alive. The job began by lifting a heavy stone slab or trapdoor in the ground. What lay beneath was a nightmare. A cesspit could be 10 to 20 feet deep, filled with liquid sewage layered with hardened sludge, crawling with rats, maggots, and insects. The smell was overwhelming, so strong it could make passers-by vomit. A night soil man climbed down a ladder or was lowered by rope into the pit itself. There was no protective gear, no gloves, no masks, just bare hands, buckets, and darkness. The most dangerous part of the job wasn't the filth, it was the air. Cesspits produced deadly gases including methane, hydrogen, sulfide, ammonia. These gases displaced oxygen. Men would descend, take one breath, and collapse instantly. Entire crews sometimes died together when one man went down and others followed to rescue him. Victorian records are filled with phrases like, "found dead at the bottom of the pit." No explosion, no scream, just silence. Many cesspits were partially liquid. If a man slipped, the sludge could behave like quicksand, thick, heavy, and impossible to escape. Men drowned upright, unable to move their arms or legs as waste closed over their faces. Others were buried alive when the pit walls collapsed, releasing tons of liquefied sewage in seconds. In some cases, bodies were never recovered. They simply became part of the pit. Night soil men worked knee-deep or chest-deep in human waste. They were exposed daily to cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery, parasitic infections. Even small cuts became lethal when infected. Many men developed chronic illnesses and died young. Others carried disease home to their families, unknowingly spreading epidemics through entire neighborhoods. During cholera outbreaks, night soil men were among the first to fall and the last to be remembered. The work was brutally simple: buckets, shovels, scrapers, ropes, wooden barrels. Waste was shoveled into buckets, hauled up by hand, then poured into barrels on carts. Those carts were taken outside the city to dumping grounds or farms, where the waste was sold as fertilizer. This was not just dangerous work, it was exhausting. A single cesspit could take an entire night to empty. Night soil men earned higher wages than many labourers. They had to. The job was so dangerous and disgusting that few would do it otherwise. But even higher pay couldn't compensate for shortened lifespans, social isolation, constant illness, the ever-present risk of sudden death. They were shunned by society. Taverns refused them entry. Landlords rejected them. Some churches barred them from services because of the smell. They kept cities clean but were treated as untouchable. In the summer of 1858, London experienced the infamous Great Stink. The River Thames, filled with untreated sewage, became unbearable. Parliament itself nearly shut down because the smell was so intense. For the first time, the wealthy could not ignore the consequences of poor sanitation. This crisis finally pushed the government to invest in a modern sewer system, engineered by Joseph Bazalgette. As sewers expanded, the need for night soil men slowly declined. But thousands had already died doing the work no one else would. Night soil men were essential to Victorian life. Without them, cesspits overflowed, disease spread fast to cities, became unlivable. They laboured in darkness, silence, and filth, so others could live comfortably above ground. Their deaths were rarely reported, their names rarely recorded. they were invisible until they were gone. Victorian Britain prided itself on progress and cleanliness, but that illusion was held together by men who climbed into pits of human waste night after night, risking suffocation, disease, and drowning. Night soil men stood between civilization and collapse, and when modern sanitation finally arrived, it did not celebrate them. It simply forgot them. The harbour is quiet in the early morning. Nets are stacked on the docks, sails flap softly in the wind, and lanterns sway as fishermen prepare to leave shore. Wives and children watch from the quay, knowing a terrible truth. Many of these men will not come back. Fishing in the Victorian era was not a job, it was a gamble with death, played out on cold, violent seas with almost no protection. Fishing families raised fishermen. Boys learned the trade almost as soon as they could walk. By age 8 or 9, many were already working aboard boats, hauling nets, baiting lines, gutting fish. There was no schooling at sea, no safety training, no choice. Fishing villages depended entirely on the sea for survival. If you didn't fish, you didn't eat, so generation after generation took to the water, knowing the odds. Victorian fishing vessels were small, wooden, and dangerously fragile. They had no engines early on, no radios, no weather forecasts, no life jackets, no rescue services. Once a boat left port, it was on its own. Storms could appear without warning. A calm morning could turn deadly by afternoon. If a boat capsized or sank, there was no help coming. The North Sea, in particular, was notorious. It was bitterly cold, violently unpredictable, full of sudden storms. Men were washed overboard by waves or tangled in nets and dragged beneath the surface. Once in the water, survival time was measured in minutes. Cold shock seized muscles. Breathing stopped. Consciousness faded. Entire crews vanished without a trace. Sometimes wreckage washed ashore weeks later. Sometimes nothing did. Victorian fishing disasters were massive and frequent. One of the deadliest occurred in 1881, when a sudden North Sea storm killed over 180 fishermen from the villages of Eyemouth, Bournemouth, and surrounding areas. In some towns, nearly every adult male fisherman died in a single day. Women were left widowed overnight. Children grew up fatherless. Communities never fully recovered. And this was not an isolated event. Storms claimed thousands of lives across the 19th century. Fishing was physically brutal even without storms. Men worked 18 to 20 hours straight in freezing spray with numb hands on slick, unstable decks. Fatigue was deadly. A tired fisherman slipped. A tired fisherman missed a wave. A tired fisherman fell overboard. Most accidents happened when men were exhausted, not reckless. Fishing equipment was heavy and unforgiving. Nets weighed hundreds of pounds when wet. Lines snapped under tension. Winches crushed hands and arms. Common injuries included crushed fingers, severed limbs, broken backs, head trauma. A man tangled in a net could be dragged under in seconds. There were no knives on hand for emergency cutting. Many drowned still wrapped in rope. There was no insurance for fishermen. If a man died, his family received nothing, no pension, no compensation. Widows relied on charity or the church. Some were forced into workhouses. Children were sent to sea early to replace lost income. Fishing villages lived with constant grief. Funerals were so common that black clothing became everyday wear. Victorians often romanticised fishermen as rugged, brave and noble, and many were. But bravery didn't stop the sea. Fishing was fatal not because men were careless, but because the sea never gave second chances. There was no way to make the job safe with the tools of the time. Every voyage was a roll of the dice. Safety improvements came slowly, stronger boats, better weather forecasting steam-powered vessels later, life-saving equipment. But most of these changes arrived after the Victorian era ended. For those who lived and died in the 1800s, fishing remained one of the deadliest professions on earth. When we picture fishing villages, nets drying in the sun, boats rocking in harbour, it's easy to forget the cost behind the image. Victorian fishermen fed the nation. They kept markets stocked and cities alive. But many paid with their lives, vanishing beneath waves that never even marked their passing. Their names are etched on weathered memorials along the coast, or lost entirely to the sea. The moment you step inside a Victorian foundry, the air changes. It presses against your skin like a living thing. The glow of furnaces turns the walls orange. Sweat pours down your face within seconds. In front of you, vats of molten metal churn and spit. Liquid iron heated to over 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. This is where Victorian steel was born. And for the men who worked here, death was always one misstep away. Steel and iron were the backbone of Victorian progress. They built railways, bridges, factories, ships, tools, weapons. Demand exploded during the Industrial Revolution, and foundries worked day and night to keep up. But the faster production went, the more dangerous the work became. Steel didn't forgive mistakes. Victorian foundries were chaotic and unforgiving. They were filled with open furnaces swinging ladles of molten metal, slick floors coated with oil and slag sparks flying constantly. There were no safety rails, no protective barriers, no modern heat-resistant gear. Workers wore wool, leather aprons and boots, barely enough to protect against molten iron splashing like liquid fire. One wrong step could mean being burned alive. Some workers were stationed directly at the furnaces. Their job was to stoke the fire, regulate temperature, open furnace doors, skim slag from molten metal. The heat was unbearable. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion and heat stroke regularly. Some fell directly into furnaces or onto hot slag. In certain foundries, deaths from heat were so common that they were considered part of the work. Molten metal was unpredictable. If it came into contact with moisture, sweat, wet tools, it could explode violently, sending burning metal spraying across the floor. These explosions burned through clothing instantly, fused skin to bone, killed multiple workers at once. Survivors were left permanently disfigured. Many died days later from infection or shock. Foundries weren't just hot, they were heavy. Workers moved massive iron moulds, beams and ingots using ropes, pulleys and brute force. Crane failures were common, loads dropped without warning, men were crushed flat, pinned against walls, severed at the waist. There were no compensation laws. If a man was killed, his family often received nothing. Foundry air was thick with coal smoke, metallic dust, chemical fumes. Workers inhaled particles that scarred lungs and destroyed breathing capacity. Common conditions included chronic bronchitis, metal fume, fever, lung scarring, early death. Many steel workers developed persistent coughs, chest pain and weakness by their 30s. Their bodies aged decades faster than normal. Steel production never stopped. Workers laboured in shifts that stretched through the night. Exhaustion slowed reflexes, deadly in an environment where timing mattered. Many fatal accidents occurred late at night when men were overtired, dehydrated and dizzy from heat. A moment of delay was all it took. While heavy steelwork was mostly done by men, boys were still employed, carrying tools, opening furnace doors, running messages, clearing slag. They worked dangerously close to molten metal. Some lost limbs. Others died instantly in accidents meant for adults. Child labour remained common well into the late Victorian period. Safety improvements came slowly. Better ventilation, limited protective equipment, improved cranes and lifting gear. But even with reforms, foundry work remained one of the most dangerous occupations well into the 20th century. Victorian steelworkers accepted the risk because there were few alternatives, and the wages were higher than factory work. Higher pay came with higher odds of death. Victorian Britain was shaped by steel. Every rail, bridge and factory frame stood because men worked in infernos, lifting liquid fire with bare hands and raw courage. Steelworkers did not just forge metal, they forged the modern world at the cost of their bodies, their health, and often their lives. Their story is written not in history books, but in burns, scars, and graves. Victorian Britain was an empire built on water. Its wealth flowed through ports. Its power crossed oceans. Its food, fuel, soldiers, and trade all moved by ship. But standing between land and sea was a workforce trapped in one of the most dangerous liminal spaces imaginable: sailors and dock workers. Men who lived with the constant knowledge that a single misstep, on deck or on the dock, could end their lives instantly. For Victorian sailors, signing on to a ship often meant surrendering all control over their lives. Once at sea, sailors had no legal protection, no real wages. Until the voyage ended, no escape. Captains held near absolute authority. Discipline was harsh. Beatings were common. Desertion was punished severely. Some men were press-ganged, forcibly taken into service against their will. Once aboard, survival depended on obedience, endurance, and luck. Victorian sailing ships were massive wooden structures constantly in motion. Decks were slick with seawater coated in fish oil or grease cluttered with ropes and equipment. Sailors climbed rigging dozens of feet above deck in high winds, often at night. Falls were common. A man who slipped from the rigging usually died instantly, either smashed against the deck or swallowed by the sea. No one stopped the ship to look for him. Weather forecasting did not exist. Storms struck without warning. Ships were torn apart by waves, driven onto rocks, capsized in open water. When a ship went down, survival was rare. There were no radios, no rescue helicopters, no emergency beacons. Entire crews vanished without ever being found. Families often never knew how or where their loved ones died. Ship conditions were filthy and overcrowded. Sailors slept in cramped quarters with poor ventilation, surrounded by damp wood and stagnant air. Diseases spread rapidly: typhus, cholera, dysentery, scurvy. Scurvy alone killed thousands caused by vitamin deficiency during long voyages. Men's gums rotted, teeth fell out, wounds reopened. Eventually they died slowly and painfully. Some ships lost more men to disease than to storms. If sailors faced death at sea, dock workers faced it on land. Victorian docks were chaotic, dangerous places filled with swinging cargo towering stacks of crates, heavy chains, cranes operated by hand loads weighing tons were lifted above workers' heads using ropes that snapped without warning. Men were crushed, severed or thrown into the water daily. Few accidents were investigated. Dock work was casual labour. If you died, another man took your place by morning. Victorian dock workers often could not swim. If a man fell into the harbour, heavy boots pulled him under cold, shocked his body, polluted water filled his lungs. Harbours were full of sewage, chemicals and debris. Men drowned within sight of land. Rescue equipment was rare. Life rings were uncommon. Many docks had no ladders. Dock work was irregular. Men gathered at docks each morning hoping to be chosen for work. Some waited hours only to be turned away. When they did get work, it was brutal. Lifting, carrying, loading, unloading, exhaustion caused accidents. Alcohol became a coping mechanism for many, leading to even more injuries and deaths. Poverty, danger, and uncertainty ruled dockside life. If a sailor died at sea, his wages often died with him. If a dock worker was killed, his family received nothing. Widows and children were left destitute. There were no pensions, no insurance, no safety nets. The sea took men, and society moved on. Despite everything, sailors and dock workers kept Britain alive. They fed cities, fueled factories, carried soldiers, expanded trade. The Victorian Empire rested on their shoulders. And yet their suffering was romanticised or ignored, turned into songs, paintings and myths that hid the brutal truth. Victorian sailors and dock workers lived between two dangers: the violence of the sea and the indifference of society. They faced death daily so goods could move, empires could expand, and cities could thrive. Many were lost without records. Many were buried without names. Many were never found at all. They were the men who kept Britain connected to the world and paid for it with their lives. Imagine smelling a place before you ever see it. Long before a Victorian tannery came into view, you knew it was there. The air grew thick, sour and sharp, carrying a stench so powerful it clung to your clothes and hair for days. It was the smell of rot, urine, chemicals and death mixed together. For most people, that smell was a warning to stay away. For tannery workers, it was the smell of survival. Every morning, men and boys walked directly into it, knowing that the job waiting for them was one of the most miserable and dangerous in the entire Victorian world. Leather was everywhere in the 19th century. Shoes, belts, saddles, bookbindings, factory belts, military gear, gloves, luggage and upholstery all depended on it. Victorian industry could not function without leather, and yet almost no one wanted to know how it was made. The process was so disgusting and so hazardous that tanneries were deliberately pushed to the edges of towns or placed downstream from cities so the smell and waste would not offend respectable society, out of sight, out of mind. But for the workers inside, there was no escape. The work began with raw animal hides, usually from cows, sheep, goats or horses. These hides arrived fresh from slaughterhouses, often still warm, sometimes crawling with insects. They were heavy, stiff and coated in blood, fat and clinging flesh. Tannery workers hauled them by hand, stacking them in piles, where they immediately began to rot. This was not an accident. Controlled decay was part of the tanning process, and workers were forced to handle decomposing skins daily. The first stage was soaking. Hides were submerged in large vats filled with water to loosen dirt and blood. These vats were often reused again and again, turning the water cloudy and foul. Workers reached in with bare hands, lifting hides that had already begun to stink. Cuts and scrapes were unavoidable, and every open wound was an invitation for infection. In the Victorian era, antibiotics did not exist. A small cut could become fatal. After soaking came liming. Hides were lowered into pits filled with lime and water, sometimes mixed with old urine. This mixture burned the skin and softened the hair follicles so the fur could be removed. Men stood ankle deep or knee deep in these pits for hours at a time. Lime caused chemical burns that cracked the skin, opening it further to disease. Workers often complained that their legs never fully healed, remaining white, scarred, and painful for the rest of their lives. Next came the scraping. Hides were draped over wooden beams and scraped with curved knives to remove hair and leftover flesh. This was brutal physical labour. The hides were heavy, slippery, and resisted every movement. Muscles ached constantly. A slip of the blade could slice into a hand or leg, and those wounds were immediately exposed to rotting organic matter. Infection set in fast, often turning deadly. Then came one of the most revolting stages of all, softening. In many tanneries, hides were soaked in mixtures that included animal dung or fermented urine. In some cases, workers literally stomped hides barefoot in pits of excrement to soften the fibres. The smell was overpowering. Men gagged and vomited while they worked, but stopping meant losing wages. Victorian tannery workers learned quickly that dignity had no place in their job. One of the most dangerous threats lurking in tanneries was disease. Tannery workers were at high risk for anthrax, a deadly bacterial infection known at the time as wool sorter's disease or rag picker's disease. Anthrax spores lived in animal hides and could enter the body through cuts or be inhaled as dust. Victims often fell ill suddenly, developing fever, breathing difficulty, and severe swelling. Many died within days. Some collapsed at work and never stood up again. Skin diseases were constant. Workers developed painful rashes, ulcers, and infections that never healed. Their hands cracked and bled continuously. Nails fell off. Fingers stiffened and twisted from constant exposure to chemicals. Many tannery workers lost feeling in their hands entirely, a numbness that crept up over years until they could barely grip their tools. The air inside a tannery was as dangerous as the vats. Chemical fumes rose constantly from the pits. Lime dust filled the air. Ammonia burned the lungs. Hydrogen sulfide, produced by rotting organic matter, could knock a man unconscious in seconds. In enclosed spaces, these gases were deadly. Workers sometimes collapsed without warning, suffocating on the tannery floor, while others were too afraid to approach the pit that killed them. Drowning was another ever-present danger. Tanning pits were deep, often poorly marked and uncovered. A misstep could send a man plunging into a vat of caustic liquid. Weighted down by heavy clothing, he could drown before help arrived. In some cases, bodies were not recovered until hours later. There was no rescue equipment, no safety rules, just silence and replacement. Children worked in tanneries too. Boys as young as 8 or 9 carried hides, stirred vats, and cleaned floors. Their smaller bodies made them easier to assign dangerous tasks. They breathed the same poisoned air, stood in the same chemicals, and suffered the same injuries. Many never grew properly. Their bones weakened, their lungs damaged before adulthood. Childhood in a tannery ended quickly. Working hours were long and relentless. 12 to 14-hour days were common, 6 days a week. The work did not stop for illness. If a man missed a day, he lost wages. If he missed too many, he lost his job. There were always others desperate enough to take his place. Exhaustion made accidents more likely, but slowing down was not an option. Socially, tannery workers were shunned. They smelled permanently no matter how often they washed. Their clothes absorbed the stench of chemicals and rot. Many taverns refused to serve them. Some landlords refused to rent to them. Churches sometimes seated them separately. Victorian society depended on leather, but despised the people who made it. Medical care was rare. Most tannery workers could not afford doctors. When injuries became infected, workers tried home remedies, or simply endured the pain until their bodies gave out. Death records from industrial towns show tannery workers dying young from respiratory disease, infection, or unknown causes that were likely linked to chemical exposure. As industrialization increased, tanneries grew larger, not safer. Production scaled up, pits multiplied, and chemicals became more concentrated. Profits increased, but working conditions barely improved. Safety regulations were minimal and poorly enforced. Inspectors existed on paper, not in practice. Despite all of this, tanneries continued to operate because leather was essential. Soldiers needed boots, factories needed belts, cities needed horses outfitted with harnesses. The suffering of tannery workers was considered acceptable collateral damage. By the late Victorian era, some reforms began to appear. Better drainage, improved ventilation, and limited chemical handling rules slowly reduced the worst dangers. But for generations of workers before that, the damage was already done. Bodies were broken, lives shortened, names forgotten. The tannery worker's legacy is hidden in plain sight. Every leather-bound book, every polished shoe, every industrial belt carried the imprint of men who stood ankle-deep in filth and poison so society could move forward. They were not heroes in paintings or statues. They were avoided, ignored, and erased. Victorian progress was built on many kinds of suffering, but few jobs combined: filth, disease, chemical poisoning, and social exile, quite like the tannery. To work there was to accept that your health would be traded for wages, that your body would wear out early, and that no one would thank you for it. The tannery was not just a workplace, it was a slow execution disguised as employment. Long before you saw him, you usually heard him. The scrape of boots on stone, the clink of traps, the squeal of something caught and dying. Victorian rat catchers moved through the city like shadows, appearing where filth collected and disappearing before anyone thanked them. They worked in basements, alleys, docks, slaughterhouses and sewers, places most people avoided even in daylight. Their job was simple in theory: remove rats. In practice, it was one of the most dangerous and disease-ridden occupations of the Victorian era. Victorian cities were drowning in rats, rapid urban growth, overflowing sewage, slaughterhouse waste, grain warehouses, and overcrowded housing created a perfect environment for rodents. Rats infested homes, hospitals, ships, markets, and food stores. They chewed through walls, spread contamination, and carried deadly diseases. For the public, rats were a nuisance and a fear. For rat catchers, they were a constant threat to life. Rat catching was rarely a formal job. Most rat catchers were poor men, sometimes boys who worked independently or were hired by landlords, businesses, or city officials. Some were former dock workers, sewer labourers, or night soil men who had already been pushed into society's margins. It was dirty work that paid just enough to survive and often required working at night when rats were most active. The tools of the trade were crude. traps made of iron or wood, sacks slung over shoulders, sticks, poison. Dogs trained to kill rats quickly. Many rat catchers also relied on their bare hands. They grabbed rats by the tail or neck, pulling them from holes and nests. A single mistake could result in a vicious bite, and rat bites were rarely minor. Rats carried bacteria that could turn a wound septic within days. Victorian medicine did not yet understand germ theory fully. Many rat catchers had no idea that a single bite could lead to fever, infection, and death. They treated wounds with rags, alcohol, or nothing at all. Infections spread quickly in dirty working conditions. Swollen limbs, blackened skin, and gangrene were common outcomes. Some men lost fingers or hands. Others lost their lives. The real danger, however, came from disease. Rats were carriers of typhus, leptospirosis, and other deadly infections. Although the Great Plague outbreaks were long past, rat-borne disease never truly disappeared. In damp, overcrowded Victorian neighbourhoods, illness spread easily. Rat catchers were exposed constantly to contaminated urine, faeces, and blood. They worked knee-deep in filth, often with open wounds. Leptospirosis, sometimes called sewer fever, entered the body through cuts or mucous membranes. Symptoms began like a mild flu, but quickly worsened. Victims developed jaundice, kidney failure, internal bleeding, and delirium. Many died painfully, others survived but were left with permanent organ damage. Rat catchers suffered from this disease at far higher rates than the general population. Sewers were among the most dangerous places rat catchers worked. Victorian sewers were dark, narrow, and filled with toxic gases. Methane, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide collected in enclosed spaces. A man could collapse from lack of oxygen in seconds. Some rat catchers never made it back out. Their bodies were found days later, sometimes surrounded by the very rats they were hired to kill. Basements were little better. Many were flooded, poorly ventilated, and full of rotting food waste. Rat nests were hidden behind walls and under floors. To reach them, rat catchers crawled into tight spaces where escape was difficult. If a beam collapsed or a wall gave way, there was no help coming. Poison was another constant hazard. Rat catchers often used arsenic-based compounds to kill infestations. Handling poison daily without protective equipment meant accidental ingestion was common. Men inhaled powder, absorbed it through skin, or contaminated their food. Symptoms of poisoning included vomiting, stomach pain, neurological damage, and eventual death. Some rat catchers poisoned themselves slowly without ever realizing the cause. Dogs were essential tools, but also added danger. Packs of terriers were trained to kill rats rapidly, but working in close quarters meant bites were common. Rabies, though rare, was a terrifying possibility. A single infected bite was a death sentence. Once symptoms appeared, there was no cure. The work was physically exhausting. Rat catchers spent hours crouching, climbing, crawling, and lifting heavy sacks of dead animals. They worked long hours with no guarantee of pay. Some days yielded dozens of rats. Other days yielded nothing. Hunger was constant. Many rat catchers lived in the same slums they were hired to protect. During disease outbreaks, rat catchers were both in demand and at extreme risk. When typhus or cholera spread, authorities ordered increased rat removal. Catchers worked non-stop in the most contaminated areas of the city. Many became sick themselves, collapsing mid-job. Some were blamed for spreading disease rather than preventing it. As the Victorian era progressed, public sanitation slowly improved. Sewers expanded, waste removal improved, rat populations declined in some areas. But for decades, rat catchers served as an unrecognised frontline defence against epidemic. They absorbed the danger so others would not have to. There were no pensions for rat catchers, no compensation for injury or death. When a man could no longer work, he simply disappeared into poverty or the workhouse. Families were left destitute. Society moved on. The irony is cruel. Rat catchers helped protect Victorian cities from disease, contamination, and famine. Without them, infestations would have spiralled out of control. Yet they were treated as disposable, unclean, and barely human. Their work left no monuments, no plaques, no memorials, only records of illness, death, and silence. To be a Victorian rat catcher was to live constantly on the edge of infection and social exile. Every bite could be fatal, every shift could be your last, and even if you survived, no one would ever thank you for keeping the city safe. The rats were feared. The job was necessary. The men who did it were forgotten. In Victorian Britain, cleanliness was seen as a moral virtue. Clean clothes meant respectability, order, and decency. But behind every crisp white shirt and spotless dress stood a woman whose body was being slowly destroyed to keep up that illusion. She was the laundress, and her job was one of the most physically punishing and quietly deadly occupations of the era. Laundry in the Victorian period was not a light domestic chore. It was industrial labour carried out by hand, day after day, often from dawn until night. Laundresses worked in private homes, communal washhouses, institutional laundries, and commercial operations serving hotels, hospitals, factories, and the wealthy. Wherever they worked, the conditions were brutal. A laundress's day usually began before sunrise. Water had to be fetched and heated long before washing could begin. This meant hauling heavy buckets from wells or pumps and feeding coal or wood into large fires beneath enormous copper boiling tubs. These tubs were dangerous even before the work started. Falls into boiling water are not uncommon, especially in crowded or poorly lit washhouses. Once the water was heated, the real labour began. Clothes were sorted by hand, often soaked overnight in filthy water to loosen dirt. Laundresses scrubbed garments on wooden washboards using harsh soaps made with lye. These soaps burned the skin, stripping away natural oils until hands cracked, bled, and split open. Many laundresses worked with raw, bleeding fingers wrapped in rags, unable to stop because stopping meant losing wages. Scrubbing was only one part of the process. Heavy, wet clothing had to be lifted, twisted, and wrung repeatedly. A single wet sheet could weigh more than a small child. Laundresses wrung garments by hand or used primitive mangles that crushed fingers and wrists if used incorrectly. Repetitive strain destroyed joints over time. Many women developed permanently bent backs, swollen knees, and arthritic hands before middle age. The heat was relentless. Laundry rooms were filled with steam from boiling tubs and wet fabric. Ventilation was poor or non-existent. In summer, temperatures soared to unbearable levels. Women worked drenched in sweat, struggling to breathe thick, damp air. Heat exhaustion was common. Some laundresses collapsed mid-shift and never recovered. Burns were an everyday hazard. Boiling water sloshed from tubs. Steam scalded exposed skin. Hot irons were handled continuously for hours. Severe burns were treated with home remedies or ignored entirely. Infections set in easily. Without antibiotics, a burn could turn fatal. Ironing itself was exhausting and dangerous. Victorian irons were solid blocks of metal heated directly on fires. They weighed several pounds each. Laundresses lifted, pressed, and moved them constantly. If an iron slipped, it could cause devastating injury. Burns to the hands, arms, and torso were common, and some women carried scars for life. Chemical exposure added another layer of danger. Laundresses worked with bleaching agents, bluing chemicals, and stain removers that contained toxic substances. Chlorine fumes burned lungs and eyes. Prolonged exposure caused respiratory problems, chronic coughing, and weakness. Some women slowly poisoned themselves without understanding why their health was failing. Many laundresses worked in basements or dedicated wash houses that were damp, cold in winter, and stifling in summer. These environments encouraged illness. Tuberculosis spread easily in overcrowded, steamy rooms. Women coughed blood, fainted from weakness, and kept working until they physically could not stand. The work week was long and unforgiving. 12 to 14-hour days were common, especially for commercial laundries. There were no rest days when orders piled up. Laundry had deadlines. Hotels, hospitals, and wealthy households demanded clean linens regardless of the laundress's health. Despite the grueling labour, pay was low. Laundresses were often paid by the piece, not by the hour. This meant working faster increased income, but also increased injury risk. Many women pushed themselves far beyond safe limits just to survive. Exhaustion led to mistakes. Mistakes led to burns, crushed fingers, and collapse. Pregnant women worked until they physically could not continue. Some gave birth prematurely. Others miscarried after lifting heavy loads or collapsing from heat. There was no maternity leave, no compensation, and no sympathy. If a woman stopped working, her family went hungry. Children often worked alongside their mothers. Girls helped carry water, scrub garments, and operate mangles. They grew up bent over washboards, breathing steam and chemicals. Their education suffered. Their bodies were damaged early. Many never escaped the cycle of poverty that laundry work represented. Socially, laundresses occupied a strange position. They were necessary but not respected. Wealthy households relied on them but rarely acknowledged their suffering. Laundresses were seen as coarse, unfeminine, and lower class because their work was physical and dirty. The same society that demanded spotless clothing looked down on the women who made it possible. Illness was constant. Chronic back pain, joint damage, lung disease, heart strain, and infections plagued laundresses. Many died young from conditions directly linked to overwork and exposure. Death certificates often listed vague causes like exhaustion or natural causes, hiding the true cost of the labour. Workhouses and institutions employed laundresses under even harsher conditions. Women in poorhouses, prisons, and asylums were forced to perform laundry as punishment or labour. They worked longer hours with worse equipment and no pay at all. Collapse and death were not uncommon. As the Victorian era progressed, commercial steam laundries expanded. While machinery increased output, it did not necessarily make the job safer. Steam presses exploded. Boilers failed. Women were scalded or crushed by malfunctioning equipment. Industrial laundry introduced new dangers rather than removing old ones. Despite growing awareness, meaningful reform came slowly. Some regulations improved ventilation or limited hours, but enforcement was weak. Laundresses remained largely invisible in labour reform movements. Their suffering was domestic, hidden behind closed doors and clean curtains. Yet Victorian society could not function without them. Hospitals needed sterile linens, hotels needed fresh bedding, families needed clean clothes. Disease prevention itself depended on laundry. Ironically, the women tasked with maintaining cleanliness often lived and worked in conditions that destroyed their own health. By the time a laundress could no longer work, her body was usually broken, bent spine, swollen joints, scarred hands, chronic illness. There was no retirement. Many ended their lives in poverty, the workhouse, or early graves. The laundress's story is one of quiet endurance. No explosions, no dramatic disasters, just relentless labour day after day until the body failed. Victorian cleanliness was purchased not with soap and water alone, but with women's lives. To be a Victorian laundress was to trade health for survival, to spend a lifetime in heat and steam so others could appear respectable, to suffer invisibly so society could pretend cleanliness came easily. The clothes were spotless, the cost was hidden, and the women who paid it were forgotten. When gaslights first illuminated Victorian streets, people marvelled at the glow. Cities no longer vanished into darkness after sunset. Shops stayed open longer. Streets felt safer. Progress, it seemed, had finally conquered the night. But behind every flickering gas lamp stood men who worked in places so toxic and dangerous that many never lived long enough to see old age. They were gasworks labourers, and their job was one of the deadliest and least understood occupations of the Victorian era. Gasworks were industrial plants where coal was heated in sealed ovens to produce coal gas. That gas was piped into homes, businesses, and street lamps across the city. The process sounded simple. In reality, it was a chemical nightmare carried out with almost no safety precautions. Gasworks were often located near poor neighbourhoods, hidden from the public eye, because the smell alone was unbearable. The work began with coal. Endless tons of it arrived daily, dumped into towering piles. Labourers shovelled coal by hand, feeding it into large ovens called retorts. These retorts were heated to extreme temperatures, baking the coal until it released gas. The heat was intense. Standing near the retorts felt like standing beside an open furnace. Sweat poured from workers within minutes, even in winter. As coal heated, it released a mixture of gases and byproducts. Some of these were useful, many were deadly. Carbon monoxide, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and other toxic compounds filled the air. Gasworks were poorly ventilated, trapping fumes inside low buildings. Workers breathed poison all day without realizing just how dangerous it was. Carbon monoxide was especially deadly because it was invisible and odourless. Men collapsed suddenly, sometimes mid-step, overcome without warning. Co-workers often assumed a man had fainted from heat. By the time they realised what had happened, he was already dead. Victorian medical reports describe gas workers found lifeless beside retorts, their bodies untouched but their lungs starved of oxygen. Hydrogen sulfide added another danger. It smelled like rotten eggs at low concentrations, but at higher levels it paralysed the sense of smell entirely. Workers who thought the danger had passed were often walking straight into lethal air. One breath could render a man unconscious. 2 breaths could kill him. Gasworks labour was physically brutal as well. Retorts had to be cleaned regularly. This meant opening hot ovens and scraping out glowing coke and ash by hand. Workers wore minimal protection. Burns were common, faces blistered, hair singed. Some men suffered full-body burns when sparks ignited their clothing. After coal was processed, the leftover coke had to be removed and cooled. This work involved heavy lifting in extreme heat. Exhaustion made accidents more likely. Men stumbled into hot equipment or collapsed onto burning surfaces. Many were permanently disfigured. Another dangerous task involved cleaning tar tanks. Coal tar was a thick, sticky byproduct that collected in pits and vats. Workers climbed inside these confined spaces to shovel tar by hand. The fumes were overwhelming. Men became dizzy, disoriented, and confused. Some passed out and drowned in tar. Others suffocated before help could reach them. Explosions were a constant threat. Gas leaked easily. A single spark could trigger a blast powerful enough to level entire sections of a gasworks. Fires spread rapidly through wooden structures soaked in coal residue. Workers were trapped inside burning buildings with few exits. Newspapers occasionally reported gasworks disasters that killed dozens at once, but these stories faded quickly. Disease followed gas workers home. Their clothes absorbed chemicals and soot. Skin contact with tar caused chronic rashes, sores, and cancers. Long-term exposure increased the risk of skin tumours and lung disease. Many gas workers developed persistent coughs, weakness, and chest pain that worsened over time. The work schedule was relentless. Gas production never stopped. Workers laboured in shifts around the clock, including overnight hours. Sleep deprivation weakened the body and slowed reaction times, making accidents more likely. There were no sick days. Missing work meant losing pay. Losing pay meant hunger. Children and young boys were also employed at gasworks. They hauled coal, carried tools, and cleaned floors coated in chemical residue. Their smaller bodies absorbed toxins more quickly. Many grew up with damaged lungs and shortened lifespans. Socially, gasworks labourers were stigmatised. They smelled of chemicals and coal smoke. Their skin was often stained dark. Many lived in poor housing near the gasworks because no one else wanted to live nearby. These neighbourhoods suffered higher rates of illness and early death. Medical understanding lagged far behind industrial danger. Doctors treated symptoms without addressing causes. A man with chronic coughing was told to rest. A man who collapsed was said to have a weak heart. Few recognised that the workplace itself was killing them. As the Victorian era progressed, improvements slowly appeared. Better ventilation, improved retort designs, and limited safety rules reduced some dangers. But for generations of workers, reform arrived too late. Many had already sacrificed their health and lives to keep the lights burning. Gasworks labourers made Victorian cities brighter, safer, and more modern. They extended the day, fuelled commerce, and transformed urban life. Yet they paid for that transformation with poisoned lungs, burned skin, and shortened lives. When gas lamps glowed along cobbled streets, few people stopped to think about where that light came from. Fewer still considered the men who stood in toxic heat to produce it. To be a Victorian gasworks labourer was to work in invisible danger, to breathe poison so others could see, to accept a job where collapse, explosion, or slow illness were always waiting. The lights shone brightly, the cost was hidden, and the men who paid it were largely forgotten. As we come to the end of our journey through the deadliest jobs of the Victorian era, it's worth pausing for a moment. not to admire the machines or the buildings or the progress itself, but to remember the people who made it all possible. The Victorian age is often remembered for innovation, industry and advancement. Gas-lit streets, railways stretching across the land, factories humming with productivity. But behind every symbol of progress were ordinary men, women and children whose lives were shaped and often shortened by the work they were forced to do. They climbed into chimneys and mines. They stood over furnaces and vats. They laboured in filth, heat, darkness and poison. Many never had the luxury of choice. Survival demanded endurance, and endurance demanded sacrifice. Most of them left no records behind, no portraits, no monuments. Their names were rarely written down, and yet their labour is everywhere, beneath our cities, inside our books, in the systems that still shape our world today. When we talk about history, it's easy to focus on dates, inventions, and famous figures. But history is also made of tired hands, aching lungs, and quiet resilience. It is made of people who showed up day after day, knowing the danger, because there was no other option. If these stories have reminded us of anything, it's that progress has always come at a cost, and that cost was often paid by those who were never asked, never thanked, and never remembered. So as we end this series, I hope you'll carry these workers with you, not as footnotes in history, but as human lives that mattered. Their suffering deserves to be seen. Their stories deserve to be told. Thank you for spending this time with me and for listening so thoughtfully. If you've enjoyed this series, feel free to let me know in the comments, and I'll see you again soon for another journey into the quiet, forgotten corners of history. Until then, take care and rest well.